My Italian grandmother never threw anything away. Ever. And I used to think it was just an old-world habit, something born from necessity, something that didn't apply to modern life. But then I sat down and actually calculated how much money her freezer habits were saving her every year, and I nearly fell off my chair. We are talking about hundreds in savings annually, sometimes close to 1,000, all from one humble appliance sitting in the corner of her kitchen. Today I'm going to walk you through every single one of her 25 freezer secrets, starting from number 25 and working our way down to the one trick that genuinely changed how I shop forever. These are not vague suggestions. These are specific, tested, Nonna-approved methods that have been refined over decades of Italian kitchen wisdom. Stay with me because every single one of these is worth your time and your money. Number 25. Freeze your fresh pasta dough in portions. When Nonna made pasta, she never made just enough for one meal. She would make a massive batch of fresh egg pasta dough, divide it into individual portions using a kitchen scale, wrap each portion tightly in cling film, and then place them all into a labeled freezer bag. Each portion was exactly the right size for 2 servings. When you freeze fresh pasta dough rather than the rolled pasta itself, it maintains its elasticity far better. You pull it out the night before, let it thaw slowly in the fridge, and it rolls out almost identically to fresh. One batch of dough costs pennies compared to buying fresh pasta at the supermarket. Over a month, that difference adds up significantly. Number 24. Freeze leftover wine in ice cube trays. This one surprises people every time. Nonna never poured wine down the sink. Never. If a bottle was open and not going to be finished, she would pour the remainder into ice cube trays, freeze it solid, then transfer the cubes into a clearly labeled freezer bag. Each cube is roughly 2 tablespoons of wine. When she needed wine for a risotto, a braise, or a tomato sauce, she would simply drop in 2 or 3 cubes directly from frozen. The flavor holds remarkably well, and you are essentially getting free cooking wine from something you would have otherwise wasted. This alone can save you from buying those overpriced small bottles of cooking wine at the supermarket. Number 23. Freeze Parmesan rinds for soups and broths. In Nonna's freezer, there was always a dedicated bag just for Parmesan rinds. Every time a block of Parmesan reached its end, the rind went straight into that bag rather than the bin. When she made minestrone, ribollita, or any bean soup, she would drop 2 or 3 rinds directly into the pot. As the soup simmered, the rind released an extraordinary depth of umami flavor, a saltiness and richness that you simply cannot replicate with anything else. The rinds do not dissolve completely, so you fish them out before serving. You are essentially getting flavor from something most people throw in the bin. A Parmesan rind at a deli counter sometimes costs £1 or less and does the work of an entire block. Number 22. Freeze fresh herbs in olive oil. This is one of the most visually satisfying tricks in Nonna's entire repertoire. She would take fresh herbs, typically rosemary, thyme, sage, and basil separately, chop them finely, pack them into ice cube trays, and then pour good olive oil over the top before freezing. Once frozen solid, she transferred them into labeled bags. When she needed to start a sofrito or sauté garlic for a pasta base, she would drop one of these herb cubes directly into the pan. The oil melts instantly, the herbs release their fragrance, and you have a flavor foundation that would have cost you a fresh bunch of herbs each time. Buying fresh herbs weekly is extraordinarily expensive for what you get. Number 21. Blanch and freeze seasonal greens in bulk. Every single time Nonna saw greens on sale, whether it was spinach, cavolo nero, Swiss chard, or wild greens from the market, she bought as much as she could carry. She would blanch the greens in boiling salted water for 90 seconds, immediately plunge them into ice-cold water to stop the cooking, squeeze them as dry as humanly possible, and then portion them into golf ball-sized amounts before freezing on a tray. Once frozen, they went into bags. These portions drop perfectly into pasta sauces, frittatas, and soups throughout the following months. Blanching is critical here because it deactivates the enzymes that cause greens to become mushy and lose their color in the freezer. Number 20. Freeze bread ends and stale bread for breadcrumbs. Nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, was wasted in Nonna's kitchen when it came to bread. Every bread end, every slice that was going stale, every leftover focaccia crust went straight into a freezer bag that lived on the door of her freezer. Once that bag was full, she would blitz the frozen bread in the food processor to make fresh breadcrumbs, season them with dried herbs and parmesan, and use them for everything from coating chicken cutlets to topping baked pasta. You can also toast them in olive oil for a pasta garnish called pangrattato, which Italians have used for centuries as the poor man's parmesan. Buying ready-made breadcrumbs from a supermarket when you could be making superior ones for free is something Nonna simply could not comprehend. Number 19. Freeze homemade tomato sauce in muffin tins. Nonna's tomato sauce method was legendary. When tomatoes were at their cheapest, usually in late summer, she would make enormous batches of her simple sugo. Nothing more than good tomatoes, olive oil, garlic, and basil, cooked low and slow until deeply concentrated. She would then ladle the sauce into silicone muffin tins, freeze them solid, and pop them out into freezer bags. Each muffin-sized portion was almost exactly the right amount for one generous serving of pasta. No defrosting required in most cases, because dropping them straight into a warm pan works perfectly. The cost difference between making your own sauce and buying jarred sauce is staggering, especially when the tomatoes cost almost nothing at peak season. Number 18. Freeze butter in labeled portions. This one sounds almost too simple, but the implications are significant. Whenever butter was on offer, Nonna bought as many packs as she could store. Butter freezes almost perfectly for up to 1 year without any noticeable change in quality. She would portion it into tablespoon-sized blocks using a sharp knife, wrap each block individually in grease-proof paper, and store them in a large freezer bag. This meant she always had butter available and never paid full price. In the United Kingdom, butter prices have risen dramatically in recent years. So buying in bulk on promotion and freezing it properly represents genuinely meaningful savings over 12 months. Number 17. Freeze egg yolks and whites separately. If a recipe called for only egg whites, the yolks went into a small container labeled with the quantity and date, with just a tiny pinch of salt or sugar stirred through to prevent them from becoming gelatinous when frozen. If a recipe needed only yolks, the whites went into a separate container. Nonna never wasted half an egg. Egg whites freeze brilliantly and are perfect for meringues or frittatas once thawed. Yolks work well in pasta doughs and custards. Eggs are not cheap, and throwing away half of them repeatedly because a recipe only calls for one part is the kind of waste that Nonna would have considered genuinely painful. Number 16. Freeze citrus zest before juicing. Before juicing any lemon, lime, or orange, Nonna always zested it first. Always, without exception. The zest went into small freezer bags or containers, labeled clearly, and was used for weeks afterward in biscuits, pasta sauces, marinades, and salad dressings. The zest of a frozen lemon performs almost identically to fresh. Most people juice citrus fruits and throw away the zest entirely without realizing they are discarding the most flavorful and aromatic part of the fruit. If you buy lemons regularly, which most households do, the accumulated zest you could be saving and freezing represents a genuinely valuable ingredient. Number 15. Freeze cookie and biscuit dough in logs. When Nonna baked, she baked efficiently. She would make large batches of biscuit dough, roll it into neat logs wrapped in cling film, and freeze them. Whenever she wanted fresh biscuits, she would slice rounds directly from the frozen log and bake them immediately. They barely needed any extra baking time. This method means you always have the ability to produce freshly baked goods without buying expensive pre-made versions or wasting ingredients on small batches. Italian households make extensive use of this approach for canestrelli, frolini, and similar shortbread-style biscuits that are staples throughout the year. Number 14. Freeze stock in Ziploc bags lying flat. Making stock was a weekly ritual in Nonna's kitchen. Chicken carcasses, vegetable peelings, Parmesan rinds, and herb stalks all went into the pot with cold water and were simmered for hours. The resulting stock was strained, cooled, defatted, and then poured into Ziploc freezer bags in measured amounts, typically 250 milliliters per bag. The bags were sealed, all the air pressed out, and then laid completely flat to freeze into thin sheets. These flat frozen sheets stacked like books in the freezer, taking up minimal space. Good homemade stock is the backbone of Italian cooking, and buying cartons of it from the supermarket is both expensive and inferior in taste. Number 13. Freeze milk in measured portions when on offer. Full-fat milk freezes acceptably well, though Nonna was very specific about the method. She would never freeze entire full bottles because the expansion can be problematic. Instead, she would pour milk into freezer-safe containers, leaving a gap at the top for expansion, and freeze it in 500 milliliter portions. When she needed milk, she would simply move a portion to the fridge the evening before. This is particularly useful when milk is heavily discounted near its use-by date in supermarkets. In the United Kingdom, many supermarkets discount short-dated dairy significantly. Nonna would buy it in quantity, freeze it promptly, and never pay full price for milk if she could avoid it. Number 12. Freeze blanched and sliced courgettes in summer. Italian nonnas have an almost legendary relationship with courgettes, particularly the glut that arrives every summer from the garden or from markets when prices crash. Nonna would slice her courgettes into rounds, blanch them briefly, dry them thoroughly, spread them on a lined baking tray to freeze individually, and then bag them once solid. This individual freezing step is crucial because it prevents them clumping together and allows you to take exactly the quantity you need. These frozen courgettes went into frittatas, soups, and pasta dishes throughout autumn and winter, when the same courgettes would have cost considerably more. Number 11. Freeze mashed potato in portions. This surprises many people because they assume potato does not freeze well. Nonna's technique corrected this misunderstanding entirely. She would make mashed potato with generous butter and enough salt. Allow it to cool completely, then scoop it into individual portions using an ice cream scoop onto a lined tray. Once frozen solid, the portions went into bags. The secret is that properly made, well-seasoned mashed potato with sufficient fat freezes and reheats very well. She used these portions as toppings for baked dishes, as bases for potato croquettes, and as quick side dishes. Making a large batch when potatoes are cheap and freezing, the portion saves both time and money. Number 10. Freeze marinated meat directly in its marinade. When Nonna bought meat on offer, particularly chicken thighs, pork shoulder, or lamb shoulder, she would immediately place the raw meat directly into a freezer bag with the marinade already added. Olive oil, garlic, herbs, sometimes wine, sometimes lemon. The bag was sealed and went straight into the freezer. This method is ingenious because while the meat freezes and then thaws, the marinade is actively working on the protein the entire time. By the time the meat has thawed fully in the fridge overnight, it has been marinating for hours and is deeply flavored. You are buying cheap meat when it is on offer and improving its quality simultaneously through the freezing and thawing process. Number 9. Freeze caramelized onions in an ice cube tray. Caramelized onions are one of the most time-consuming foundations of Italian cooking, requiring 45 minutes to an hour of slow, patient cooking to develop their deep sweetness. Nonna solved this by dedicating one afternoon per month to caramelizing an enormous quantity of onions in her largest pan. Once cooled, she would portion them into ice cube trays, freeze them solid, and transfer the cubes into a labeled bag. 1 or 2 cubes added to a pan would give any dish a base of flavor that would otherwise require an hour of cooking. This saves time and energy bills because cooking 6 portions of caramelized onions at once uses far less energy than cooking them 6 separate times. Number 8. Freeze fresh chilies whole without any preparation. This one is almost effortless. Nonna would buy chilies in bulk from the market during summer, particularly when Italian varieties arrived. She would wash them, dry them completely, and freeze them in a single layer on a tray before transferring to a bag. The frozen chilies could be grated directly from frozen using a fine grater directly into pasta sauces, giving fresh chili flavor and heat without any chopping. Alternatively, they could be used whole in olive oil infusions. The cell structure does change slightly when frozen, making them softer upon thawing. But for cooking purposes, this makes absolutely no difference, and the flavor is virtually identical to fresh. Number 7. Freeze homemade pesto without cheese. Nonna's basil pesto was incomparable. But the crucial thing she knew that many people do not is that you should freeze pesto without the Parmesan already incorporated. Cheese does not freeze well within pesto and causes the texture to become grainy and the flavor to turn sharp in an unpleasant way. She would blend basil, pine nuts, garlic, and olive oil only. Freeze it in small jars or ice cube trays covered with a thin layer of olive oil on top to prevent oxidation, and then add freshly grated Parmesan. Only when the pesto was thawed and ready to be served. This gave her summer basil flavor throughout the entire year for almost nothing. Number 6. Freeze cooked beans and legumes in their cooking liquid. Tinned beans are convenient, but represent genuinely poor value for money compared to dried beans. Nonna always cooked dried beans in large batches, boiling them with sage, garlic, and bay leaves until perfectly tender. She would then freeze them in portions equivalent to 1 tin, submerged in their own cooking liquid, which is itself incredibly flavorful and nutritious. These frozen portions were used exactly as you would use a tin of beans, but the flavor was far superior, and the cost per portion was dramatically lower. Italian cooking relies so heavily on beans, from pasta e fagioli to ribollita, that this habit represents significant annual savings. Number 5. Freeze leftover risotto as arancini bases. Leftover risotto was never reheated as risotto in Nonna's household. That would have been considered a culinary crime because risotto does not reheat well and loses its texture. Instead, leftover risotto was flattened onto a lined tray, frozen solid, and then cut into portions. These portions were later coated in breadcrumbs and fried to make arancini, the famous Sicilian rice balls. The starchy, sticky nature of leftover risotto is actually ideal for forming arancini because it holds together perfectly. This transforms leftovers that might otherwise be discarded into an entirely separate and genuinely delicious meal, something that would cost several pounds per portion at an Italian restaurant or deli. Number 4. Freeze whole garlic heads and use from frozen. This is one of the most overlooked and most useful tricks in Nonna's entire system. When garlic was cheap, she bought it in large nets and froze entire heads without any preparation whatsoever. Frozen garlic can be grated directly from its frozen state using a fine microplane grater, producing a fine garlic paste with no chopping and no smelly hands. The garlic goes straight from the freezer into the pan. The cold garlic actually grates more cleanly and evenly than room temperature garlic, and the flavor is essentially identical to fresh. Given that garlic is the single most used ingredient in Italian cooking, this habit alone prevents significant waste and ensures you always have garlic available when prices spike. Number 3. Freeze egg-based pasta sauces like carbonara base without eggs. The component parts of carbonara that freeze well are the guanciale or pancetta, already rendered and cooled, and the black pepper, while the egg and cheese mixture must always be made fresh. Nonna would freeze rendered, crispy guanciale portions in small bags. When she needed carbonara, The longest and most expensive part of the preparation was already done. She simply reheated the guanciale, cooked the pasta, and made the egg and cheese emulsion fresh. This means you can buy guanciale when it is available and affordable, often at Italian delis during promotions, render a large quantity at once, and have the backbone of one of Italy's most iconic pasta dishes, ready in minutes throughout the following weeks. Number 2. Freeze and repurpose day-old polenta in slabs. Polenta was a staple of Nonna's northern Italian heritage, and she cooked it in massive quantities. Hot polenta went into bowls for dinner. Whatever remained was poured into a lightly oiled baking dish, smoothed flat, and allowed to cool and set overnight. The following day, it was cut into neat rectangles layered between sheets of greaseproof paper and frozen. These frozen polenta slabs became a completely different ingredient. Nonna would grill them on a griddle pan, fry them in olive oil, or top them with tomato sauce and cheese and bake them. What began as a humble side dish became grilled polenta, fried polenta cakes, and a base for baked dishes, all from the same original batch of cornmeal costing almost nothing. And the number one trick, the single most impactful habit Nonna had. She kept a dedicated freezer inventory notebook, a small handwritten book that lived on top of the freezer and was updated every single time something went in or came out. Each entry had the item, the quantity, the date it was frozen, and a rough note on what dish it was intended for. This is the reason all 24 other tricks actually worked consistently. Without knowing what is in your freezer, food gets lost, forgotten, freezer burned, and eventually thrown away. The investment in a freezer is entirely wasted if you cannot locate and use what is inside it before it deteriorates. Nonna treated her freezer like a bank account. She knew exactly what she had deposited, exactly what she had withdrawn, and she never let anything sit unused so long that it lost its value. That notebook, combined with every single habit I've just shared with you, is the complete system behind how one Italian grandmother turned a single kitchen appliance into one of the most powerful money-saving tools in her entire household. Start with just 3 or 4 of these today and watch what happens to your food bills over the next 3 months.